The heavy iron gates of Graceland were meant to be a final, peaceful sanctuary, but they couldn't stop the chaos. Just 2 weeks after Elvis Presley was laid to rest, the silence of the night was shattered by the arrival of armed men determined to break into his grave. The authorities managed to intercept the plot, but the sheer terror of the event changed everything. Within days, the unthinkable happened. The casket was pried open, and the king was moved to a new, secret location. Today we go behind the headlines to reveal the truth about that night, why the panic set in, and what really happened when the lid was finally lifted. The open casket. At Graceland, Elvis Presley died at Graceland on August 16, 1977. He was 42. Within hours, the news was everywhere. Flags across Memphis dropped to half-staff. Radio stations switched their programming without warning, playing his songs back-to-back, one after another, like the music itself was standing in for words nobody had yet. His body was taken to the Memphis funeral home for embalming. The next day, August 17th, he came back to Graceland one final time. His father, Vernon Presley, made a decision that would shape everything that followed. He ordered a public viewing. The casket would be placed in the foyer, open, so fans could walk through and see him one last time. It wasn't a small gesture. Vernon understood what Elvis meant to people who'd never met him, strangers who'd grown up with his voice on their radios, who'd seen him on television as teenagers, who felt like they'd lost someone from their own family. So the doors opened. Over 30,000 people filed past that casket in a single day. Some drove for hours, some flew in from other states, with barely enough time to pack a bag. The line stretched down the driveway, out past the gates, and along the road outside Graceland, in the kind of Memphis heat that makes standing still feel like work. Some fans fainted in that heat, not from illness, from grief, mixed with exhaustion, mixed with the strange disorientation of actually standing in front of the casket of someone who felt, to them, larger than life. By the second day, the crowds had grown so large that President Jimmy Carter authorized the Air National Guard to help local police manage the scene. That's not a small detail. A sitting president calling in military support to help control a funeral crowd tells you something about the scale of what Memphis was dealing with that week. Decades later, Priscilla Presley wrote about that day in her memoir, Softly, As I Leave You, Life After Elvis. Her account doesn't read like the polished, official version most people remember. It reads like someone still processing the chaos of it, even 50 years on. There was no privacy for those of us closest to Elvis, including the family, she wrote. People and cameras surrounded the property. Mourners waited to be admitted to the house for a public viewing of Elvis's open casket. She described the mood outside as something close to unbearable. It was hot and muggy, and some in the crowd fainted from the heat and from emotion, she recalled. For Priscilla, and for the rest of the family, the funeral wasn't really theirs. Strangers filled the house, filed past the casket, and treated Elvis the way you'd grieve a member of your own family, because in a very real sense, for millions of people, that's exactly what he had become. They felt compelled to pay their respects as they would to a family member, Priscilla wrote. It was overwhelming. There wasn't room yet for our own grief. That line stays with you. The family's grief had to wait. 30,000 strangers got to Elvis first. The private funeral came the next day, on August 18th, held quietly inside Graceland's living room and music room. It lasted only 2 hours, starting at 2 in the afternoon. A pastor named C.W. Bradley led the service. A comedian named Jackie Kahane, who'd opened for Elvis on tour for years, gave a testimonial. Musicians who'd performed alongside him for most of his career sang some of his favorite hymns. It was small, intimate, almost ordinary compared to the chaos outside. Outside those walls, though, nothing about it was ordinary. An estimated 80,000 people lined the streets for the funeral procession, watching a line of white Cadillacs move slowly toward Forest Hill Cemetery, where Elvis would be buried beside his mother, Gladys. Reports from that day described mourners standing 3 and 4 deep along the route, some climbing onto car roofs and fences just to catch a glimpse of the hearse as it passed. Local news crews described the procession as one of the largest single gatherings Memphis had ever seen for any event, let alone a funeral. At that point, as far as the world was concerned, that was the end of the story. Elvis Presley had been seen, mourned, and buried. But the story wasn't actually over, not even close. Within 2 weeks, that casket would be opened again. Not because of a hoax, not because of a conspiracy theory dreamed up decades later online, for a reason that was disturbingly real, and that almost nobody outside Memphis knew about at the time. The rumor that wouldn't die. Almost as soon as people filed past that open casket, whispers started. Some fans swore the body in front of them didn't look right. Too smooth, too waxy. Like something out of a museum display rather than a person who had been alive just days earlier. A rumor took hold, and it spread fast. People began saying the body on display wasn't really Elvis at all, that it was a wax dummy standing in for the real thing, placed there for reasons nobody could quite agree on. Part of what fueled the rumor was the casket itself. Witnesses described what looked like beads of moisture forming on the body's forehead and hands under the funeral home lighting. To grieving fans standing in Memphis heat, staring at a face they'd only ever seen on television and record sleeves, it read as strange, unnatural, almost like the figure in front of them was starting to melt. The truth was far less dramatic. Embalmed bodies under warm lighting, in a crowded room full of body heat from thousands of mourners filing past over hours, can develop condensation. It's a basic, well-documented phenomenon in funeral science. Nothing about it points to fakery, but grief doesn't always reach for the boring explanation first. And once a rumor like that starts moving through a crowd of 30,000 people, there's no stopping it. The funeral home had also made a specific choice that, in hindsight, only added fuel to the fire. The open end of the casket was positioned slightly out of full view for most mourners passing through. Whether that was meant to control the pace of the line, or protect the family's privacy, or simply reflected standard funeral practice at the time, nobody explained it clearly to the public. And an unexplained decision during an already emotional event is exactly the kind of detail conspiracy theories tend to grab onto. None of this stayed contained to 1977 either. The wax dummy theory has resurfaced again and again over the decades since, repackaged by each new generation of Elvis conspiracy content, treated as fresh evidence every single time, even though the explanation behind it has never actually changed. There's a second layer to all this that rarely gets mentioned, and it has nothing to do with wax or lighting. Elvis's health in his final year had visibly declined. Reporters covering his last tour dates had already started writing about his weight, his exhaustion, the noticeable difference between the performer people remembered from the 60s and the man now struggling through shows in 1977. For fans who hadn't seen him in years and who were now looking at his face in a casket, the shock of that physical change may have played its own quiet role in the "that doesn't look like him" reaction. Grief does strange things to perception, so does shock. Combine those with heat, exhaustion, and a body that had visibly changed over the final, difficult year of his life, and it's not hard to understand how a rumor like this could take root, even without a single piece of real evidence behind it. What's often left out of the retelling, though, is what actually did happen to that casket just a couple of weeks later. Not because of a hoax, because of something far more disturbing and far better documented than anything the wax dummy theory ever managed to prove. A 9-year-old's last goodbye. Before any of the public chaos, before the 30,000 strangers and the National Guard and the rumors that would outlive everyone in that room, there was a quieter moment inside Graceland, one that almost nobody witnessed. Lisa Marie Presley was 9 years old when her father died. Too young, really, to process what losing him actually meant. Old enough, though, to understand that she wanted to give him something. During a private family viewing before the public was let in, Lisa Marie approached the funeral director on duty, a man named Robert Kendall. She was holding something small in her hand, a slender metal bracelet. "Mr. Kendall, can I give this to my daddy?" she asked him. Kendall hesitated. So did Priscilla, standing nearby. There was a practical concern behind the pause, something about the clasp or the fit that made the adults in the room unsure whether it was even possible. Lisa Marie didn't back down. Eventually, her resolve won out. Kendall gently guided her forward. He lifted Elvis's arm, just enough, and helped her fasten the bracelet onto her father's wrist. He told her, in that moment, that it would stay with her father forever. It's a small story, easy to miss, buried underneath everything louder that happened that week. but it's also one of the only pieces of that entire funeral that has nothing to do with fame, rumor, or spectacle. Just a daughter, a bracelet, and a promise from a stranger trying to make an impossible day slightly easier for a child. That bracelet went into the ground with him, or at least it did for a little while, because less than 3 weeks later, Elvis's casket would be reopened. Not for a viewing, not for a ceremony, for a reason that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with a threat the public barely knew about at the time. The nightmen tried to steal the body. Elvis wasn't actually buried at Graceland at first. Most people assume he was laid to rest there from day one. He wasn't. After the funeral procession on August 18th, Elvis was entombed at Forest Hill Cemetery, inside a white marble mausoleum, in a 900-pound copper coffin. He was placed beside his mother, Gladys, who had been buried there back in 1958. More than 50,000 fans visited that mausoleum in the days that followed, leaving behind thousands of floral arrangements across the lawn. Then, less than 2 weeks later, everything changed. On August 29th, police arrested 3 men near the mausoleum. According to the New York Times, the men had entered the cemetery by climbing over a back wall in the early morning hours, making their way toward the white marble structure where Elvis was entombed. The paper's account was specific about how it unfolded. Early this morning, 3 men entered the cemetery over a back wall and made their way toward the white marble mausoleum, the Times reported. The men apparently became suspicious and turned to leave, the police said. They were then arrested. A 4th man, an informant who had tipped off police in advance, was also taken into custody as part of the operation. Investigators said this wasn't a random, spur-of-the-moment break-in. Police had reportedly received advance warning that the men were planning a trial run of an actual theft, aimed at stealing Presley's body and holding it for ransom. Vernon Presley was terrified. According to people close to the family, he couldn't stand the thought of his son's body being dug up, stolen, and used as leverage by strangers. Here's where the story gets genuinely strange, though. When the case reached court, an attorney representing the 3 men called the entire plot a hoax. The Memphis Commercial Appeal later reported that the charges were dropped altogether. That detail has fueled a completely different theory over the years, one that has nothing to do with wax dummies or empty caskets. Decades later, an FBI informant who claimed direct involvement in the incident told reporters the entire grave robbery scare may have been staged, not by outsiders trying to steal Elvis's body, but by people connected to the Presley family itself. The theory goes like this. Graceland, where Elvis had lived, wasn't zoned for burials at the time. Vernon wanted his son laid to rest at the family home, not in a public cemetery exposed to exactly this kind of risk. A stage theft, or the appearance of one, gave the estate's lawyers a powerful argument to bring before the Memphis and Shelby County Board of Adjustment. Security at Forest Hill couldn't be guaranteed, so the remains needed to be moved somewhere safer. Whether the plot was real, staged, or somewhere confused in between, the outcome was the same either way. 3 weeks after Elvis died, lawyers for the estate formally petitioned for a zoning variance, citing the attempted theft and the enormous cost of maintaining round-the-clock security at a public cemetery. On September 28, 1977, that permission was granted, which meant one thing. The casket that had already been sealed, mourned over, and laid to rest was about to be opened again. Not by conspiracy theorists, not by curious fans, by the family itself, with full legal permission, for a reason that had nothing to do with rumor and everything to do with fear. What they found when the casket opened. On October 2, 1977, workers at Forest Hill Cemetery carried out the move. Both Elvis and his mother, Gladys, were exhumed from the South Mausoleum. Their caskets were transported to Graceland, to a spot in the backyard Elvis himself had once designed. He'd built it years earlier as a personal retreat, modeling it after the Self-Realization Fellowship Lake Shrine in California, a place he'd visited and found deeply calming. He'd hired a builder named Bernard Grenadier to bring it to life. He called it the Meditation Garden. He'd built it as a place to sit quietly and think. He ended up buried there instead. The reburial happened without press cameras rolling, without the crowds or the National Guard that had surrounded the funeral weeks earlier. This time, the family wanted quiet. After everything Vernon had just lived through, the theft attempt, the court petition, the zoning hearing, all he wanted was to know his son was somewhere safe and somewhere close. For 2 months, that copper coffin had sat in a public mausoleum, exposed to exactly the kind of risk that had already, allegedly, drawn intruders once. Now, it sat behind the walls of the home Elvis had lived in a garden built with his own money, based on his own memory of a place that had once brought him peace. The empty crypt at Forest Hill stayed empty for decades afterward, a strange, quiet footnote to the whole story. It became something of a landmark in its own right. Years later, when the crypt was put up for auction by a memorabilia company, more than 10,000 fans signed a petition demanding it be pulled from sale and preserved instead, as a piece of history rather than a collector's item. The auction house eventually agreed and withdrew it. The meditation garden itself holds more than just Elvis and his mother today. Vernon Presley was later buried there too, alongside his own mother, Minnie Mae Presley. There's also a small memorial marker for Jesse Garon Presley, Elvis's stillborn twin brother, who had been buried in an unmarked grave back in Tupelo, Mississippi in 1935. He never got to see the home his brother built, so the family gave him a place there anyway, even though his actual remains stayed in Mississippi. The grave itself, according to accounts from people who've researched the site closely, is concrete-lined and reinforced with steel, built specifically to withstand exactly the kind of intrusion attempt that had already happened once at Forest Hill. As for the theory that the entire robbery attempt was staged, it's never been proven either way. No court ever formally ruled on it. The charges were dropped, the informant's later claims were never verified in court, and Vernon Presley, the one person who might have known the full truth, died in 1979 without ever addressing the accusation directly and publicly. What is certain, documented, and beyond dispute is this: Elvis Presley's casket really was reopened, twice within 2 months of his death. Once by cemetery workers acting on a court-approved zoning petition, once more by the family itself, quietly, to lay him to rest permanently at Graceland. No conspiracy theory needed to invent that story. It already happened in full view of public records, newspaper archives, and court documents that anyone can still look up today. But the reopening of the casket wasn't the last controversy tied to how Elvis actually died. A far bigger fight over what had really killed him was only just getting started. The fight over what really killed him. While Elvis's body was still being examined on the day he died, the man in charge of the autopsy made an announcement that would shape the official story for years. Jerry Francisco, the Memphis medical examiner, told reporters the cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat. He went further than that, though. Francisco stated plainly that drugs played no role in Presley's death, a claim delivered to the press while the autopsy itself was, according to later accounts, still technically in progress. It was a tidy explanation, a tragic but natural heart failure, nothing more. For a grieving public and for a family desperate to protect Elvis's legacy, it was also, in a sense, the easier story to accept. The problem was, it wasn't the full picture. Lab reports filed roughly 2 months later painted a very different scene. Toxicology results reportedly showed 14 different drugs in Elvis's system at the time of death, 10 of them at what was described as significant levels. Pathologists involved in the case also raised the possibility that Elvis may have suffered an allergic reaction, specifically anaphylactic shock, triggered by codeine pills a dentist had prescribed him, a substance he was known to have a mild allergy to. None of that lined up cleanly with Francisco's confident public statement that drugs had played no role at all. In 1979, forensic pathologist Cyril Wecht reviewed the full case, including the lab reports Francisco's initial statement had seemingly brushed past. Wecht didn't mince words about what he found. He called Elvis a walking drugstore and concluded that what actually killed him was polypharmacy, the combined cumulative effect of several prescription drugs acting on his body all at once. According to Wecht, that combination depressed Elvis's central nervous system, starting with the brain, in a way far more consistent with the evidence than a sudden, drug-free cardiac event. The disagreement didn't stay contained to a handful of pathologists arguing over paperwork. In 1991, authors Charles Thompson and James Cole published a book titled The Death of Elvis: What Really Happened, directly challenging Francisco's original findings. The book argued there had been no evidence of disease to support a natural cardiac death, and insisted instead that Elvis had died from an overdose of multiple drugs. The claims were serious enough that a formal complaint eventually made its way through Tennessee's court system. By 1994, an appellate court was reviewing the case, weighing the book's allegations against the official record. The court ultimately noted that the state's chief medical examiner had reviewed all the relevant documents and found insufficient reason to conclude that any irregularities or violations of law had occurred in how the original death certificate had been handled. In other words, the paperwork stood. But the argument over what it actually meant never really settled. Even now, decades later, historians and biographers researching Elvis's death describe the same conclusion Vecht reached back in 1979. The idea that drugs played no role in his death simply doesn't hold up against the toxicology reports filed at the time. What's disputed isn't whether medication was involved, it's how much responsibility that fact deserves. Weighed against a heart already strained by years of exhaustion, poor health, and the physical demands of a life spent almost entirely on stage. Put it all together, and the real story of what happened to Elvis Presley's body after he died turns out to be stranger and better documented than any rumor about wax dummies or hidden switches ever managed to be. His casket really was opened, not once but twice within 2 months of his burial. His body really was moved under a cloud of fear and legal maneuvering that's never been fully resolved. And the official explanation for how he died was challenged almost immediately by the very evidence collected the day he was pronounced dead. But there's one more piece of this story most people have never heard. A decision Vernon Presley made in the days after burying his son, one that kept part of the truth locked away for exactly 50 years. The report, Vernon sealed. For 50 years, Elvis's last hours were quiet, almost mundane, right up until they weren't. He'd gone to his master suite around 7 that morning to rest before a flight scheduled for that evening. He was last seen alive around 8. By early afternoon, his fiancée at the time, Ginger Alden, found him unresponsive on the bathroom floor. Paramedics were called. They couldn't revive him. He was taken by ambulance to Baptist Memorial Hospital, a facility his own doctor specifically requested, even though a different hospital sat only 5 minutes from Graceland. Dr. Nick reportedly chose Baptist because he knew the staff there would be discreet. He was pronounced dead at 3:30 that afternoon. What happened next moved fast. The autopsy began that same day, led by pathologist E. Eric Muirhead, working with a team of doctors at Baptist Memorial. Some accounts describe a team of 6 pathologists. Others put the number at 9. Either way, it was a serious, well-staffed procedure, conducted within hours of his death, not days. 3 days later, Shelby County released its official conclusion. The cause of death was listed as hypertensive cardiovascular disease, tied to high blood pressure and blocked arteries. A heart attack, in plain language, brought on by years of underlying strain. Here's the detail that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story. The autopsy wasn't ordered by a district attorney or by any outside legal authority investigating a suspicious death. It was requested directly by Vernon Presley as the family's right for their own son. And once the results came back, Vernon made another decision that would shape the mystery around Elvis's death for the next 50 years. He had the full autopsy report sealed, not released to the press, not made available to researchers or biographers, locked away by his explicit instruction until the 50th anniversary of his son's death. That anniversary fell in 2027, decades after Vernon himself had passed away, and long after nearly everyone directly involved in that day had died as well. For half a century, that decision left a strange gap at the center of the story. The public cause of death, cardiac arrhythmia tied to hypertensive heart disease, became the accepted explanation almost by default, repeated in headlines and biographies for years. Meanwhile, the full underlying report, the one document that might have settled the argument once and for all, sat locked away, unavailable to the researchers, journalists, and pathologists who spent decades arguing over what it might actually say. What was known publicly, even without the sealed report, painted its own complicated picture. Elvis had documented struggles with hypertension, some degree of cardiovascular compromise, and a colon obstruction that had troubled him for years. He'd also fought a long, visible battle with his weight in his final seasons on tour. None of that, on its own, explained everything. But it gave both sides of the later argument something real to point to. A toxicologist involved in reviewing the case afterward, Dr. Ronald Finkel, described his role plainly when reporters eventually tracked him down. His job, he said, was to conduct a complete forensic analysis of what drugs were present in Elvis's system and at what levels, then leave the harder question, whether that was actually what killed him, for others to argue about. It's a distinction that mattered a great deal in the years of dispute that followed. The drugs were there. Whether they were the cause, a contributing factor, or simply present alongside a genuinely failing heart, was a different question entirely, and not one the toxicology alone could answer. It's a strange kind of ending for a controversy this loud. Not a cover-up exposed, not a smoking gun finally revealed, just a grieving father's decision, made in the days after burying his only son, to keep one piece of the truth private for longer than most people spend a lifetime. Whether that 50-year seal was meant to protect Elvis's dignity, shield the family from further scrutiny, or simply buy enough distance that the argument might finally quiet down. Vernon never explained his reasoning before he died in 1979. He just made the decision, sealed the file, and left the rest of the story to be pieced together by everyone else, one court case, one biography, and one reopened casket at a time. That gap, the years of silence around what really happened to Elvis's body and why, turned out to be exactly the kind of space conspiracy theories love to fill. And one writer, more than anyone else, filled it. The woman who convinced millions he never died. None of what actually happened to Elvis's body, the reopened casket, the reburial, the sealed autopsy report, ever stopped the rumors that he hadn't really died at all. If anything, the secrecy fed them. The clearest, strangest chapter of that story starts with a writer named Gail Brewer Giorgio. In 1988, she published a book that would become a genuine commercial sensation. Originally titled The Most Incredible Elvis Presley Story Ever Told, it was later reprinted under a punchier name, Is Elvis Alive? The book leaned heavily on what Brewer Giorgio described as FBI documents, arguing that Elvis had actually been recruited by federal agents to help take down a criminal organization she called the Fraternity. According to her theory, once Elvis came under suspicion as a mole inside that organization, faking his death became the only way to disappear and protect himself. Asked directly, on record, whether she believed Elvis was still alive, Brewer Giorgio gave an answer carefully built to avoid a straight yes or no. "Do I know if Elvis is alive today? No, I don't know," she told Time magazine. "But I know he didn't die on August 16th. That kind of phrasing, raising doubt without committing to a claim, became something of a signature for her. She rarely said outright that Elvis was alive. She simply kept insisting his death raised questions, a framing that let the theory spread without ever requiring proof. The book came bundled with something that made headlines all on its own. A cassette tape featuring what Brewer Giorgio suggested might be a recording of Elvis's actual voice, recorded years after his supposed death. Commentary on the tape openly speculated about whether the voice belonged to Presley. It didn't. Years later, in a 2015 documentary called Orion, the Man Who Would Be King, both Brewer Giorgio and the man behind the recordings admitted the entire thing had been arranged as a publicity stunt from the very beginning. By then, though, the damage, or the myth, depending on how you look at it, had already spread far beyond anything a single correction could undo. In 1987, a woman named Louise Welling claimed she'd seen Elvis standing at a Burger King in Kalamazoo, Michigan, a city he'd actually performed in just 4 months before his death. The claim triggered a full wave of copycat sightings throughout 1988. Suddenly, Elvis was being spotted in malls, airports, and fast food restaurants across the country, each report treated with just enough seriousness by local news to keep the story alive. Brewer Giorgio rode that wave everywhere. She appeared on Larry King Live, on The Oprah Winfrey Show, on The Geraldo Rivera Show. Each appearance introduced her theory to an even wider national audience, and each one added fuel to a phenomenon that, by 1988, had become genuinely difficult to separate from the real, factual record of Elvis's death. Skeptics who studied the phenomenon closely pointed out something Brewer Giorgio's fans rarely addressed directly. Elvis's death had been witnessed by numerous close friends and family members. It had been documented extensively by Memphis medical personnel who worked on his body at Baptist Memorial Hospital. It had produced both a death certificate and a formal autopsy report, the same report that, as we now know, sat sealed away for the following 50 years. None of that stopped the theory from becoming its own small industry. Believers, who came to be nicknamed Alivers, built an entire body of supposed evidence around small, disconnected details. The most famous involves his own tombstone at Graceland, which spells his middle name Aaron, while his birth certificate reportedly used the spelling Aaron. To Alivers, that discrepancy wasn't a simple clerical inconsistency. It was treated as a coded signal, deliberately left behind to hint that Elvis was still out there somewhere. There's a far more mundane explanation. Historical records suggest Elvis genuinely used both spellings of his own middle name at different points in his life, likely influenced by the name of his stillborn twin brother, Jesse Garin Presley. A minor, human inconsistency, repurposed decades later as proof of a hoax that never happened. Even Elvis's own inner circle occasionally got pulled into the speculation, whether they meant to or not. Country singer Merle Haggard, in a 1979 interview with People magazine, mused publicly that Elvis's death could have been staged. It would be the first chance for freedom in his entire life, Haggard said, and it could have been a scheme Colonel Parker dreamed up. It's a quote that says more about how trapped people around Elvis perceived his final years to be than it does about any real evidence of a hoax. Even someone who knew him, someone with no real stake in the alive theory, could look at how exhausted and controlled Elvis's life had become and find it at least emotionally believable that disappearing might have felt to him like the only way out. That's really the through line connecting every piece of this story: the real reopened casket, the real grave robbery scare, the real sealed autopsy, and the entirely invented sightings and coded tombstones. People wanted desperately for the ending to be different than it was. For a man who'd spent his entire adult life being watched, managed, and consumed by an audience that never let him go, even in death, somewhere out there was a version of the story where he'd finally slipped free of all of it. He hadn't. But the wanting, it turns out, was powerful enough to build an entire mythology on its own, one that persisted for decades after the actual, documented, thoroughly witnessed truth had already been recorded, sealed, and quietly buried in a garden he built for himself, long before any of this began. That's the real story behind Elvis Presley's casket. No hoax, no empty coffin, no wax dummy waiting to be discovered. Just a grieving family, a genuine threat, a quiet garden built for peace, and a medical dispute that took decades to even partly untangle.